I want to welcome you to Kokoro Conversations. My name's Alex Lang,
And I'm Rebekah Anderson.
and we're here to talk about conversation topics that we find interesting to lead you to a more intentional life. And today, what we're going to be talking about is the concept of security. And I think for all of us to lead a really intentional life, we have to feel secure in who we are as a person. And often, if we don't feel secure, it's very hard for us to direct our lives in the right way. In fact, I think we're acting a lot out of insecurity when we don't really feel like we have our grounding. So today we're going to talk about that as a concept. And to begin our conversation, I want to ask you, which is, what is the most secure that you have ever felt in your life?
Yeah, there was a time I had just gone through quite a bit as ending kind of a period of my life with a lot of uncertainty. And I'd started to apply for jobs and was just realizing that the world was kind of at my feet. And for a while, I had been very riddled with self-doubt. So I start applying for these jobs and I'm really trying to put in the effort to feel better about who I am, because if I don't believe that I have something to bring to a job, I'm not going to do very
And how old
well.
are you at this point?
That's a good question. I think it's like 25.
So 25 is the first time, this is the most secure you've ever felt.
Yeah, I think
It's
so.
25 years in. I just want to make
Yeah,
sure that's
25. Not to say that there weren't, I think I was 26 actually. But not to say that there weren't glimpses of feeling some sense of security in myself, but this was like the most secure.
And you had just finished your education, yes,
hmm
at that point. So what was it about that moment that made you feel secure in applying for these jobs?
Yeah, I think for a long time I had been building to that, but to be totally honest with you, a big part of what was so helpful was I had been feeling this doubt of, gosh, can I do it? And then I start applying for these jobs, and whereas I wasn't feeling great about myself for some of the years honestly preceding, I was hearing from the time talking to these places where I was looking, you're ex- you are really eh, you're exactly what we're looking for. And so what I want to be clear about is that it wasn't hearing that feedback that made me feel secure. It was simply I had been so riddled by my own sense of doubt that when I started to take the first gentle steps toward it, I was able to say, I'm here. And no matter how these interviews go, it doesn't say anything about who I am as a
And
person.
this is your first big job, I'm assuming.
That's right. I mean, it's not like I hadn't had other jobs before, but
This
this
is
is
like the
a
first job in your career. Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm going to be working full time, making not just a part-time salary, healthcare benefits,
The
the
whole
whole
deal.
nine.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing it forced me to do was to really go and say, other people's opinions of me cannot matter as much as how I feel about myself. So it forced me to be really kind and compassionate to myself. And then what kind of took me over the edge in terms of feeling secure, it would have been one thing if I went into that feeling really good about myself and then getting rejected. I think what really helped me feel secure in myself was I went in saying to myself, no matter what happens, no matter if I have the best outcome or whatever I consider to be the worst, which would be that they get on screen, they take one look at you and they go, what is wrong with you? Why the hell did you apply to go here or for this job? How could you possibly think that? I think I went in going, no matter what happens, none of that matters because I love and care about myself more than I care about what anyone thinks of me here.
Mm.
But I'm curious to know, what about you, Alex? What is the most secure you've ever felt in your life?
You know, this is actually a really hard question for me to answer because I don't know if I've ever felt entirely secure, ever.
Mhm.
I would say that the first glimmer of security in my life actually came with a job also. I had applied, this was back when I was 19, and I had applied to be the head swim coach of one of the summer club teams like in the area. So like the way it worked in Virginia was there were all these kind of private pools, and then you could belong to them, and then they each had a swim team, and that was part of a league, right? And there were dozens and dozens of these pools everywhere. And so I belonged to one of these pools. I applied to be their swim coach. They had already actually chosen a candidate who was in her 30s, well seasoned. And so I came in pretty much having nothing to lose. And literally through the power of my voice and my persuasion and this kind of presentation I gave to that board, I convinced them to hire me over this woman. They actually had to call this woman up and tell her, we're actually going with another candidate. And I remember the guy who had actually gotten me the interview called me up and he said, I don't know what you said to them, but whatever you said, he's like, he goes, they went in an entirely different direction. And he's like, he goes, congrats on that.
You were 19 years old.
I was 19. So what that told me, and I already had a sense that my ability to speak was something that could move people, because when we were juniors in high school, we all had, it was like you had to give a speech, and I gave a speech that was hands down, everybody, it was like that was the best speech we'd heard. And so it gave me a sense that I could do it. And I could do, like if in the right circumstances, my speaking could move people. And I don't want you to think of it as manipulation, but the idea is that my words had the ability to impact people and make them think differently. And so that was the first time when it really counted. Right. And I came away thinking, yeah, like there's something there. It's not just this one aspect of when I was a junior in high school. Like I got a job through this. And so this was where I kind of had this idea, was after that summer that I came back and I said, you know what, I think I really want to be a pastor, because I wanted to use that ability in my life all the time. Yeah. And that was one of the best ways to do it was through that. And I felt I loved religion. And so I wanted to study it. So it all kind of felt like it fit. But the security that I got from that was a sense that I have a skill. And that skill is something that if I can utilize it, it will always allow for me to make sure that I'm taken care of. I can always kind of have a job. I can always know that my words matter. And I think that's something that for me, from a security standpoint, is really interesting, which is that I think for a lot of people, they speak and no one listens. And I have always felt from the time I was young, I spoke a lot and nobody listened. Yeah. But that was the first time that just through the power of my oratory, I was able to make people turn and hear me. And there's a security in that, a really interesting kind of security that I think if you've never experienced it before, if you've never stood in front of a crowd and been able to kind of hold their attention, there's a power in that to know, you're able to do something that not many people can do. And that skill, if you keep working on it, can not only transform your life, but the lives of others. And that has always been probably one of my greatest anchors of security in my life. So that brings us to the flip side, though, which is, what is the most insecure you have ever felt in your life?
Yeah, I think the truth is, being young, there were so many insecurities that came over me. So there was a time when I was about 15 years old. I just weathered what I called the worst year of my life at that point. And I would say, honestly, it really was, because I had no tools to be able to understand what was going on at that point in time. So I've weathered more difficult things, but it's been easier than that was. And I felt a big part was I was just not managing what was happening in my life very well at all.
So what are the circumstances? Explain to me what's going on.
I wasn't doing well in school. I'd had my first boyfriend that year too, I remember. And so just to give you a sense of when this is happening, it's like June. So I've just finished the school year. I'm not doing well in school. My grandma died earlier that year. I remember my dog, who was like my emotional support animal without actually being an emotional support animal. she got really, really sick, and we thought she was gonna die too, making me choke up just remembering how sick she was. But I just thought I was gonna lose, like, the one thing that it felt like I was getting love from. And on top of it, I'm at ballet. I'm not managing the stress of that really well. And that year we had a national festival that we had to dance at. So the pressure was on for everybody. And I was doing really well in my ballet career, the best I'd ever done actually in the fall. And then in the spring, as like stressors kind of came onto each other, I just was really going downhill quick. And I put on weight. I got the fat talk that year for probably the first time. And anyways, I just wasn't doing well. And then I was like not really able to be fun with the girls I danced with. And I can remember they were like gossiping about me a lot. And it felt like I was not getting positive feedback anywhere. And
You had like no safe space. Like there was like no place you could retreat to.
that's exactly right. On top of it, I was like not sleeping a lot. Not because I couldn't sleep, but because I was like trying to stay up late and do my homework. And it was honestly making it worse to stay up so late and then talking to that boyfriend on Facebook Messenger late into the night too, which was also not helping. So I was just a mess, and I felt like a mess. And I thought everyone else thought I was a mess. And I didn't feel like I was safe, and I didn't feel worthy at all. So,
Mm.
um, that was really kind of,
And what was there a moment you could remember where you felt like you turned a corner?
yeah.
No.
That summer, well, I will say too, the school year ended, dance ended for the year. I can remember a friend of mine that I was dancing with, she came up to me and she said, "You look really sad. Are you okay?" And I said, I've just been having a hard time in general. And on top of it, like there had been a sleepover, I didn't go. And I was like, I just feel like everyone was talking about me based on how they're treating me today. And I just remember she looked at me and she said, "You're right. I was at the sleepover and we did say things." And she was like, "And we were wrong. That was not okay that we did that to you." And she's like, "And you know what? It could just as easily be me." And I remember it led to a conversation that we all had as a group about how we talk about each other. Because
Mm.
I'm sure they were just letting off steam. It was a long year for all of us. It was kind of brutal on all of us. So I see it very differently now. But at that time, that's your life. That's your life. For me, it was my lifeline, was my
Mhm.
friends. But so I went into the summer feeling better about myself. I had a group of friends from school I started spending a lot more time with that were actually great for me. But then that summer, I went away on a trip with my youth group, a mission trip. And I remember we got to tell the story of our spiritual journey. And I didn't even really think about it that much. I just told everybody exactly what I had gone through that year. And nobody flinched. I could see that people were hearing what I was saying and receiving it. And um and they saw me very differently than I saw myself. I remember one girl who was much older than me, she said, you're like one of the strongest people I've ever met. And I had never that was not how I saw myself at all, to say the least, but it meant a lot. But, I'm curious to know for you what the most I know you said you've never felt fully secure. I wanted you to know I identified with that as well, just because I think we both come from a background where we were judged pretty harshly from a young age. So sadly, that lives in you. But what's the time when you felt the most insecure?
Yeah, I would say for me, probably one of the most insecure times of my life was when I was beginning 8th grade. So in our high school, we had so few students that 8th grade started is where high school started. So there was 5 grades. When I got there, there was a boy who was in 10th grade, I believe, who was in our algebra class. And this kid, for whatever reason, like zeroed in on me. He was a fellow redhead, but he was like crazy, like just this crazy guy. And he wanted to like bring physical harm to me. He was looking for the right moment to make it happen. And Like I was originally, because I lived relatively close to the school, I could walk home. And so that's kind of how we started. And he lived right near the school. So he'd wait for me as I was walking home, and then he'd start like coming after me, and he wanted to like, basically he was looking for an opportunity to hurt me. Now I was usually surrounded by friends, so it was harder for him, and he didn't have a lot of people behind him. I hated going to football games at our school because it was it was actually held at a stadium where my mom literally went to elementary school, which was condemned. So the whole place was condemned, but the field was usable. So just imagine, it's just very dark. It's like all these dark corners. And, at what would often happen, and this is the South, I remember there were like race riots. I mean, there was a lot of fights that happened at these football games. And so going into it, for me, it was always very scary because it always felt like, who is going to be around the corner who could hurt me? And this kid saw me there, and he was trying to like corner me at one point, and I just stopped going to the games. I had to start getting driven to school, getting driven away so that I wouldn't see him. And he was literally in that class. Now, he eventually, within, I would say, maybe 2 months, it maybe wasn't even that long, he just dropped out. He was just done. And looking back on it now, I understand better like his situation. It was clear now that I look at it, I say, oh, this kid was growing up in poverty. He had no structure at home. And his compensation for that was trying to exert power over people who were weaker. But I remember just dealing with this day in and day out. And when I finally said something to my parents, my dad was like, should we get a restraining order? And I was like, no, oh my God, no. Like, to me, that would be the worst thing, to actually go to court and to have to deal with it, because then it's like, you're really in this kind of, to me anyway, at that time, I was like, you'd be in this huge mess. And like, then you're like, not only him, but everybody else is like zeroing in on me. So thankfully, he just went away. And I remember what was interesting was, years later, I was in college, and I was probably 21 at this point. And as a result of that incident, I had always kind of been into lifting weights, but I really started lifting weights. And I got huge by the time I was like graduating from college or graduating from high school and going into college. And I remember I was 21, I was home from school, we were downtown with some friends, and we were getting a meal. And I was walking through, and he comes walking through, this guy, he's a waiter there at this restaurant. And my friend, he looks over at me, this guy who I lift weights with, and he goes, that's the dude? Because I told him the story about the guy. He goes, that's the guy? He goes, why are you afraid of this guy? Like, he's like tiny compared to you. Now, at that time, he was tiny, but he's crazy. See, that's the difference, right? Just because somebody's smaller than you and doesn't have the same kind of physique as you, crazy goes a long way. And he was crazy. Like, I don't know what's happened to him to this day. I've actually tried to figure out who he was and where he is. I've not been able to find anything about him. But that moment at the restaurant, it made me realize that time of insecurity when I was in 8th grade, where I just felt like I could get destroyed at any moment in time. Like, this guy could come after me, he could take me out, that I had kind of transcended that. And that in some ways I didn't need to be afraid anymore. It was just that moment of saying, and my friend saying to me, like, this is the guy? Like, this is this guy who you've built up to be this huge monster in your mind? I mean, he's nothing. And there's a truth to the idea that in our insecurities, we create these images of people in our mind to make them maybe worse than they are, because we feel so incapable of fending for ourselves, caring for ourselves. And so we kind of build it up to be much worse than maybe it is. But that was kind of a huge turning point for me, is to realize, oh, I don't need to be physically afraid in the same way that I was when I was younger.
Absolutely.
So this brings up a kind of an interesting question, though, because I've kind of gotten into this. Where do you think a lot of our insecurities come from?
Yeah, I think we come by all of our insecurities honestly. So as I alluded to earlier, you and I both come from homes that were in some ways like, or not even necessarily homes, but we grew up in environments where there was a lot of criticism. And so I think a lot of times our deepest insecurities are things we heard early on in our life that became part of how we understood ourselves.
Yeah. So what's one for you that made you feel, something that was told to you early on that made you feel insecure?
I think one of the worst insecurities I face is just feeling inadequate.
Mm,
Just feeling like I'll never really be enough. I'll never amount to anything or be good,
capable.
capable, nothing. Like I'm just kind of going to be stuck. Or that I just won't have any power at all because for a long time that wasn't even a message that was coming at me directly. It was just kind of the state of my life. It felt like anytime I tried to claim some sort of control or agency, it was taken away from me and greater control was exerted over me.
Mm. I think that that's interesting. When we're young, it's and I don't think that as a parent you realize how, just a single phrase, something you might be saying in the moment that that you're just saying because of a circumstance, how that can get embedded in your child's mind and how that can create this sense of insecurity for decades even, and how that later on somebody else saying that same thing, not realizing it has any kind of connection or like that, but they're hitting this nerve. Like, have you ever spoken to somebody and you say something and they just they like lose it, and you're like, what did I say? I don't even understand. And then you come to find later that when you sit down and you say, hey, I don't know what happened back there, but you got really upset. And if you're kind and you kind of really come at it from a place of care, they will often reflect and tell you. And I've had people say, yeah, you have to understand, like, my mom used to say stuff like that to me when I was young. And it was something that I thought was just kind of a little joke, a little jab, but it clearly went super deep.
Right. And I would go a step further to say, too, if a person's feeling good about themselves, sometimes those little comments just roll right off their shoulders. But I know I've found for myself, I can work through something that has been a story that I know is false. And if I'm not feeling good about myself and someone hits that,
Yeah.
I can melt. And I can remember a couple years ago, really like before that time of feeling secure, I got so mad at myself because I was like, shouldn't like loving myself and accepting myself be easy? Like it should feel good. Why is it so hard for me? Like, why can't I get myself to believe this? And I had to kind of face the fact that judgment and kind of beating critics to whatever they were going to say was how I protected myself for a long time, especially in those early stages of like kind of softening myself a little bit. Criticism, when I was feeling myself in that soft place, felt even harsher for a period of time, and it got better. But all that to say, like, it's a complex journey to address some of those stories.
Yeah. And I think that as, when you're in a place of power over someone, whether you're a boss or a manager or a teacher, I think that one of the most inspiring things you can do is to be aware that the people who you're with, that they have they come with a lot of baggage. And so something, that I've been a teacher for a long time. I've taught people, I've taught youth. And something that I realized early on is that I would try to create an environment where everybody was accepted for who they were. But I also wanted to kind of figure out, I would poke. It's interesting. I think about doing this, like I would poke. And I realize now that one of the reasons why I would do it, I would make fun, is that I wanted to see where are those points where if I poke at you, you really kind of like you collapse a little bit. Because if I poke at you at that and you collapse, I know that's a weak spot. Not that I want to exploit, but that I want to be able to build up. So something that I remember with you, actually, when you were in youth group, is I poked around a little bit at the aspect of your intelligence, right? Like I made fun, and I realized when it came to that, you shut down like almost immediately, and I was like, oh, this is a place where even though I could tell you were very, very intelligent, that was something that you didn't believe about yourself, right? So for me, once I understood that, I was like, oh, that's off limits. I'm not going to do that anymore. And I'm going to turn that around and I'm going to try to build her up because I know that that's something that she needs to feel better about herself because that's a real place of insecurity.
Yeah. I think I'm like going back to that. I kind of forgot that you poked like that, but I remember it. And I think one of the reasons why it felt so sensitive was that it felt like that was what everybody made fun of me for. And a big sense of insecurity that I couldn't articulate until probably the past 3 or 4 years. I like to hide. I don't really I like to hide behind what I'm good at. And what I've learned is that the way others see me is often so different than how I see myself. So there are certain areas where I feel really good and I can allow myself to be seen and it's fine. But being in a place where somebody sees the thing I don't like about me, very sensitive. So I grew up around friends, brothers, sisters, dance teachers that would make pokes about my intelligence all the time. And I think where we were at, that felt like the one place where I might be able to escape people seeing me like that. And then it was like, it's here too. All right. Well, I guess I gotta put on the armor and get ready for those jabs here too. So it was interesting just because I didn't quite think of the pokes in that way either, of that being like kind of trying to understand where the sensitivities were as a way of building them up. To me, I think I felt initially found out.
Because we carry around all this baggage with us, the things that have happened, these experiences that we've had, and those experiences, they shape our insecurities in these really profound ways that can be very hard for us to escape, to get away from. And what ends up happening for a lot of people, they're not aware of their insecurities. They don't even really know what they are so much. And if they do know what they are, they tend to lean into compensation mechanisms. So the idea would be like, well, if I don't feel smart, I'm going to overcompensate by being egotistical and arrogant. I know that that's how I dealt with it early on, where I was like, I didn't feel intelligent. So I was going to be like, look how smart I am with this, right? Which of course sends the signal to people, you're not really that smart,
Yeah.
right? Like you're doing the very thing that you don't want to have happen. Right.
Yeah. Well, I heard this phrase and I've loved it. We think it's a long walk from I'm a worthless piece of shit to I'm the best there is. And really they're at the same spot, standing still.
Oh, interesting.
Same exact place. And not to say like having a strong self-esteem means that you come from a place of not having a strong self-esteem. Not at all. It's that when we don't feel good about ourselves, we puff ourselves up to try and overcompensate for what we feel. And that's how some people deal with it. I tend to deal with it. I mean, sometimes I can maybe inflate my self-ego, but I like to just hide and disappear and kind of just not even interact at all because my dad had this phrase. He was like, it's better to be quiet and appear a fool than open your mouth and remove all doubt. And sometimes that phrase pops into my head and I'm like, oh yeah, that I'm sure it's a wise statement, but on the wrong person, it can cause a lot of insecurity.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think this brings us to an interesting question, which is, how do we go about creating security in our lives?
Yeah.
What's the best way for us Because I think all of us feel insecure in some ways, and some of us have, we've been talking about like emotional insecurity. Some of us have insecurity in little physical ways, like we're financially insecure, maybe we're with people who abuse us, physically, sexually. There's a lot of other types of insecurity, for food insecurity. I mean, literally, there's so many ways that we can feel insecure and be insecure in our lives. And so I'm interested to know, like, what do you think we need to do to create security? Like, how do we move up Maslow's hierarchy of need from, to kind of get to a place where we feel secure?
Yeah. I think my best answer, at least where I find myself lately, is I think a big part of it is finding people who love and accept us exactly as we are. Finding people that help us to receive the love that we couldn't get, or to counter the judgments, or to see our flaws and to love us not in spite of them, but because of them. But I think the reality is, you taught me this quite young. Whenever we love someone, we know that at some point they will let us down. It's part of the reality of being vulnerable with anyone. And so what we have to know and what we have to cultivate is, I think it's almost reparenting ourselves, giving ourselves the love that we need. So when we feel insecure, not just realizing where that comes from, but going, what didn't I get in the past when I felt this way? And how can I give that to myself? And so for me, like, having this insecurity of not feeling adequate, realizing I don't need to be adequate to be lovable exactly as I am, and to offer myself that, and to know that at the end of the day, I can offer that to myself whenever anyone doesn't. And then for me, another aspect is being a person who is religious. I receive that from myself. I receive that from the people in my life that I love most. But I think that at the end of the day, when I can't offer it to myself, I know that there is a divine force at play in the world. For me, that is God, that is Jesus. That is always there for me, whether I receive it from anyone else or not.
Mm.
Yeah, but I mean, how do you feel about that? What is your answer, I guess? Because I feel like it could be different from mine.
Well, I agree with everything that you said. And I think that getting to that point, though, I think is hard. That's a struggle. I think for what I see is a lot of people fumble around in the dark, and if they really feel insecure in who they are, that it does take, I think, it takes an internal locus to be able to move forward. But I do think that one of the best things that can happen to us, and I've seen this because I've done this for other people, is that I think we as human beings, we need to look for people who are insecure. And there's different people who can see that. Some people see people's insecurities and they prey on them.
Mm.
And then there's a whole other group of people who see people's insecurities and they say, you know what, I want to build you up. And sometimes it takes another person who's outside of us to see the best in who we are and to help us believe in ourselves. And so for me, that happened with me, where I saw some people saw some things in me that I didn't necessarily see in myself. And it gave me the hope and the ability and the wherewithal to believe you can do this. Like you can do this. Just teachers who sat down and said, you are talented in this area. You have some things that are good here. Where my entire life, I hadn't really heard anything like that. But to hear just a few people say, you do have some skills. You're actually pretty good at this. Oh, actually the way you wrote this, that's really good. Just little things that you can say to somebody that can change the entire trajectory. Because I think to get to where you are, what you're talking about, sometimes there are baby steps to even get to the point where you're able to turn that around and feel like, oh, I can do that within myself, that I am a lovable person. And sometimes it just takes a few kind comments from someone else to make us really feel that and to see that and to be willing to embrace and engage with that. So that's why I would encourage you all that if you see somebody in your life who you feel doesn't have security, who lacks this kind of belief in themselves, that you should look for those little things that make them who they are, the positive things that you can bring out. And I can't emphasize enough how just a few little comments, a few kind words can completely change the course of somebody's life. Because when you see them and you give them the opportunity to feel like, oh, like I do have something important to give to the world, that lays the foundation for kind of creating security in our lives, both of physically and emotionally.
Absolutely.
So I just want to say thank you for listening to us. I hope that you've gotten something out of this conversation. I always enjoy talking about these types of things, so I don't hear them spoken about too often. And to live your life intentionally, if you're feeling insecure in your life and you want to intentionally change that, I would say that you should listen to kind of what I think Rebekah said, which is, I do think you need to move to a place where you can feel healed and where you can see within yourself that you are lovable. And that often takes therapy. It takes, time where you can work through some of that baggage that we carry with us. And I hope that in your life at some point you will feel very, very secure so that one day you can walk around and say, you know what, I am good enough as I am, and I don't have to worry about it. So we look forward to seeing you next time for another conversation.